Right now, my thinking is that the course will continue into next month and probably end sometime in November. Although somebody asked me if I could guarantee to be alive to keep offering it in 2029 with all of us healthy, I should keep doing it, but I don't know if that helps. I'm going to take a break after that. So a couple of folks have come up to me and asked about different things they might be interested in me doing, and I'm always open to listening. I just have not thoroughly thought what I would want to do subsequently, but I will do something, either a series individual talks or a combination of some of them. In any event, let's get on to today, organizing the war. Well, it's pretty easy to organize a war if you have the organization for a war. Well, Britain just won in the 7 Years' War, which we know as the French and Indian War, a 7 years war fighting in the Caribbean and in India and in Europe and in North America. She had the organizational structure to fight a war. And it had been in existence in one form or another for a couple of hundred years, but what Britain had done in the 7 Years' War, she had beaten everybody had fought against her. So not only did she have the organizational structure, not only did she have the folks on payroll, so to speak, and they were on payroll, she had really reasonably talented people. What did the fledgling United States have? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No executive. Let me spend a minute or two on what that means. In our country, even then, even in the colonies, you had a governor, you had an executive council of some sort, and you had a judiciary, which, in elementary school, you remember the 3 branches of government. There was no executive, there was no judiciary. Think about not having an executive to direct your military forces. Who's in charge? Do we need somebody in charge? We had absolutely no executive authority. We had no army. We had no navy. We had no treasury. And we had no diplomats. And we won.
Oh, don't give it away.
So, stumbling, bumbling, and fumbling, somehow or another, 2 things had to happen. The Brits had to make mistakes, and we had to do OJT. I don't know if any of you were in the service, but OJT was on-the-job training. This is how it's going to be done. I'll give you an example which always struck me. So what the Congress did in lieu of no executive, and I'll speak up a little bit more why that was then, but what they did is they created committees. So there was a committee for everything. And every member of the Congress was on 11 different committees that all managed to meet simultaneously. But one of my personal heroes, John Adams, happened to have been on the Army Committee. So one of the things he had to do is he had to create rules for the Army. I mean, basic rules, like what are the ranks in the Army? Who salutes who? Who gets promoted? How do you get to this rank? How much do you get paid for it? I mean, he had to write out all of the regulations for the Army. Now, I'm exaggerating a bit, as I tend to do. I tend to exaggerate a bit. Obviously, there was a role model. The British Army had regulations. So when it said something about the king, you crossed that out, and then you had to rewrite things. So he wrote the regulations for the Army. Then he was off the Army committee because they like to rotate committees, and he ended up on the Navy committee. And so what did he have to do there? He had to write the regulations for the Navy. But in essence, there was a lack of mobilization capacity. And what do I mean? Well, you know, this group of 500 troops is off there, and we know we've got to supply them with a week's supply of food. So we've got 500 guys, 3 meals a day. Oh, that's 1,500. And they're going to be gone for 7 days, so whatever 7 times 1,500 is. Okay. Somebody had to do that computation. It's a little difficult when you don't know how many guys there are, when you think there are 500 and it turns out there are 800. Or you think there are 500 and it turns out there are 150. So the on-the-job training had to be done in the midst of a war. This wasn't like, okay, we're going to form a Navy and we're going to form an Army and we'll get ourselves organized and we'll get routines down or we'll get procedures. And then a couple of years from now, if there's a war, we've organized, and it had to be done right in the middle of battles. Now we'll talk next week about Washington. So Washington is appointed, and I'll discuss this in a moment, he's appointed general. That's great. But a general can't function just as a general. I mean, you got 11,000 people around Boston. He can't go around to 11,000 people and talk to 11,000 people. You need a staff. There was no staff. There were no staff officers. There were folks like Washington who had some experience in the British military. Few and far between. But things were, in one sense, much, much worse than I'm even portraying them now. Because we were not talking about the United States Army. We were talking about a continental army. What did that mean? Well, it's more than just a word. The difference is that the emphasis now was not on some sort of a national force that had to be created. It was on how do we deal with the state militias who were actually there on the scene prepared to fight. And what's the relationship between the Continental Army and the state militias? In New England, militias, which were these local towns, elected their own officers. Now I saw a couple of heads shaking here. some guys who've had some experience in the military, and I don't know what your experience in the military was exactly, but my experience, I didn't vote for any of my officers. In fact, I was an enlisted man, I thought my captain was, oh, I can't say that. But seriously, these local folks at Lexington and at Concord elected their officers. Well, how does that relate to the officers in the Continental Army? Who gives orders to who? Who obeys who? How do you do it? How do you get control so that you're getting a single directed effort to achieve a particular goal? Okay, let's fight this battle over here, get off on that, oh, no, we just voted, we're not going on that hill. There's too many trees. So, it wasn't simply a matter of John Adams sitting down and writing regulations for the Continental Army. Something had to be done to begin the process of molding some sort of a unified effort. And that began, in my view, with the selection of Washington. And I'm going to speak most of the next talk about George. I call him George, we're very familiar. I mean, there's so many cities, towns, states, high schools, colleges. He's a legend. In fact, he was such a legend that he was a legend in his own time. People, while he was alive, were calling him father of the country. So how did Washington come to be General-in-Chief? And it really was John Adams. Washington was a delegate to the Continental Congress. And unlike every other member of the Continental Congress, who dressed like we're dressed today, he dressed for every meeting of the Continental Congress in his uniform. He never said anything, never asked for anything. Sat there quietly at the back of the room with a uniform. And Adams realized two things. That we had to respect the regionalism that existed, which I've spoken about a great deal in many different contexts. And that called for a recognition that Virginia was the wealthiest state with the largest population and would have to make undoubtedly the greatest contribution in terms of the eventual output for this army. Which meant, in essence, in Adams' mind, George Washington. Now, what was interesting is that the Congress was able to create an army by appointing the general officers. So they appointed Washington commander-in-chief, and they gave him a commission. And later on, sort of at the end of this course, I'll recall this moment of talking about Washington's commission. And they created a number of brigadier generals and major generals to point out how regional this effort was. The most successful American officer in early 1776 was a gentleman named Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold had led the Americans, one portion of the American force that invaded Canada. Subsequently, they were defeated, but his performance was absolutely outstanding as a military officer. He was a bookseller from New Haven, Connecticut. So he expected to be appointed Major General. But Congress decided, no, we're not going to appoint him Major General, we're going to appoint him Brigadier General, because New England already had 2 Major Generals. We couldn't give New England an extra Major General because we had to balance out the regional interests of New England, the Middle Atlantic states, the Southern states. So quality of performance, inherent skill at the task was subordinated to regionalism. But it was also subordinated to something else that's exceedingly important to understand because it has the most profound effect on our military to this very day. Benedict Arnold got a bunch of friends of his together and said, hey, look, go and lobby for me, I should be a Major General. Eventually he was promoted to Major General. And the Congress decided, no. The ultimate authority over the Army has got to be a civilian authority. Recently, in January, February, President Biden appointed Secretary of Defense, I think a former general named Austin, I think his name. And they had to get a waiver from Congress of the statute that prohibits former generals within a certain time frame from serving as Secretary of Defense. Every officer in the Army, Navy, Air Force, everyone, without exception, is taught, learns, and absorbs civilian control of the military, and it all started here with this Congress. This Congress then decided that we're going to have the general officers, the Congress will appoint the general officers. So no matter how well you performed in the field, you were a lieutenant and they raised you to captain, major, colonel, you weren't getting raised by your superior officer to the general officer rank. That was Congress. Faced now with the state militias really being in control of the initial stages of the war, Congress adopted the state militias. Now, what do I mean? The state militia stayed state militias. The New Hampshire militia was the New Hampshire militia, whatever state, Rhode Island, Maryland. But by adopting them, they subsumed them into the control by the commander-in-chief, who now directed the militia up to that hill over there, which has a lot of trees, but you will now go up on that hill, even though your officers don't think that's a good place to go. And that meant something else, of course. If you're going to adopt the militia, don't you think you have to supply the militia? Don't you think you have to pay the militia? So what the control by absorption meant is it meant added responsibility. At the same time, the states were not about to turn everything over to the Congress or to the commander-in-chief. They were not going to accept total control over the militia, and the states would determine how the militia was raised and who came into the militia. So what you had is you had a struggle between an emerging, nascent, incipient, weak, sort of centralized authority, and the jealousy and the concern and the fear on the part of the states. Remember, the states were fighting against what they perceived to be a national tyranny, a British national tyranny. Well, I mean, I'm going to fight against a British national tyranny. I'm certainly not going to create my own tyranny here by turning everything over to some Congress. One of the problems that was inherent in the militia was enlistment. So folks joined the militia for a period of time. They joined the militia, generally speaking, for a 90-day period or a 1-year period. They could re-enlist, but you couldn't force them to re-enlist. I don't know how many of you were up on World War II, but when December 7th occurred, every serviceman, we didn't have many servicewomen, but every serviceman found that their enlistment, which was up next month, they had signed the contract, was extended automatically for the duration of the war. Couldn't do that here. So what you had is a group of soldiers who would fight up until their enlistment was over, and then they would go home. I mean, literally go home. And I don't mean, 6 guys out of 158 guys went home. No, I meant 156 out of 158 guys went home. And how are you going to get replacements? Anybody know when the first draft in the United States was?
Civil War?
Would you stop giving correct answers? 1863. So there was no draft. So these 156 guys went home. They need 156 guys. Where am I going to get them? It was dependent on the state governor. State governor is going to call out new militia. Maybe. So there was not a consistency of a supply of manpower, let alone a supply of arms or powder or cannon. Dealing with the manpower issue was absolutely crucial. Pretty hard to fight a battle against a guy who's got 5,000 on the other side of the hill, and I've got 5,000 here, but tomorrow night 3,000 are going home. And I don't know when I'm getting the next 3,000 in. So there's a constancy of replacement based on these limited enlistments. But there were more problems with the militia. Because the militia were locally raised and really let's pretend the Hill was our little town at that time. Well, pretty much all of us sort of kind of know each other. And we're picking out the officer because this guy is going to give us more beer than that guy, because who knows if we're going to fight. And you know each other. Well, your dear friend just got shot and killed. If that doesn't scare the living daylights out of you and make you want to get the hell out of there, or when your enlistment is up, not to re-enlist. By the same token, the comradeship that one felt for your neighbor tended to make these militia units more cohesive than one would otherwise expect, but cohesiveness within the militia. But there was a profound lack of discipline even in these units on their best day. Because these folks had been farmers. These folks had been your local lumberyard guy and your local mechanic. And almost nobody had ever fought in any kind of organized military combat. So they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to drill. In those days, armies seemed so colossally stupid to us, primarily because it was colossally stupid. What they would do, they'd get in a line, and the other guy got in a line, and you walked toward each other, and you said, "Scaredy cat, run away." Well, it's a little more than that, because now you took a shot at them, and they stood there. Then they took a shot at you, and you stood there. Then you advanced a little more, and they advanced a little more, and somebody put a bayonet on their rifle or musket and charged it. They stood in lines. Well, if you're going to stand in line, you have to be trained how to stand in line. So think of the desk in front of me as the line, and you guys are the enemy, and you're coming over here too. Well, I can't just stand in line here. I've got to turn a portion of my line to face you over here. Well, you need to be trained in how to turn to properly face that guy. And discipline was not a strength of the militia. But it went further than the discipline of how do you turn the line, how do you fire your musket or your rifle. When Washington got to Boston, what he found is there was no latrine system. Now, I'm not going to go into the details because they're pretty gruesome. And we're right next door to a restaurant. Let's put it this way. There was no organized system of regulations of what you do with your waste. You did whatever you were called upon to do. You did it where you felt you needed to do what you needed to do. It would not surprise you, I imagine, to understand that the amount of illness in those camps was horrific. Molding and creating an army was no easy thing, to say the least. So what Washington started to do is he started to create continental regiments. The basic fighting unit tended to be a regiment. And for those of you who have modern military experience don't think regiment the way we have regiment now. I mean, it was maybe 800 guys, 600 guys. But that structure was the militia structure, and he started to create continental regiments. He started to create continental regiments where the enlistment period was not 90 days in 1 year, tended to be 3 years. And these folks, these continental soldiers, became the elite of the army. They were more diverse, not from just the local town, nor the local state. They tended to get better officers and better training. They tended to stay together longer. And they had something that the military always emphasizes: pride in self, pride in your capacity to handle the task in front of you. We didn't have parallel armies, but it was close. We also didn't have a national strategy. Our national strategy basically was hold off the British. And the national strategy is, well, wherever the Continental Army is what our national strategy is. So if the Continental Army and the militias were in Boston, that's the strategy was Boston. If they were in New York, then we're going to defend New York. It wasn't until significantly later in the war that the leaders in Congress and Washington began to see that they needed something more. We'll talk about this when we talk about the battles. And that particularly occurred when the French landed here. When the French troops came to America, the French brought with them a professionalism that the Americans simply did not have. So what you have then is, wherever the British are, we're going to fight them. Because remember that the British represented a threat every place in the country that was along the seacoast. Now, they were not threatening up in the Alleghenies and Appalachians, but they were threatening all along the seacoast. They were threatening down the Champlain Valley in New York, and they had the ability to maneuver because they had the Navy. I haven't spoken much about the American Navy, but it was created about the same time. I'll give you just one or two little tidbits. One, you may remember John Paul Jones. We remember him from elementary school. Don't give up the ship. And there were a couple of ships that took on the British and did pretty well. Actually, the Americans had a little fleet. They took a whole bunch of privateers, and I'll explain now what a privateer is. It's a private ship. It's not part of your official navy. You put a couple of guns on it. The Congress says you can go out and raid the other guys. And they got about 7 little ships out of New England, I think out of Newport, and they invaded the Bahamas. And they captured the Bahamas. There's a fun fact. We should have had the Bahamas. And they took powder and they took guns and they ran away. God knows if the British Navy ever comes. So not only were structural issues prevalent in the beginning in the attempt to organize the war, but there was an extraordinary lack of the basic supplies that were needed to fight the battle. The colonies, the states, had no manufacturing capacity. The British deliberately prevented the colonies from developing the many iron foundries. So there were no places that you could easily get cannonballs or even muskets. And if you got lucky and you got cannonballs and muskets, you needed powder. And there were very few places that you could get powder. I've touched on this before in other talks that I've given. But it was an ongoing issue, and it molded a great deal of what happened, particularly in the earlier years of the war, until France came into the war actively and openly on our side in the alliance of 1778. What then were the advantages that the Americans had? I mean, I've just spent almost all of this by telling you we were in deep doo-doo. And how the hell could we do it? Turning to the Congress first, there were some pretty smart people in the Congress. They were pretty sharp. They knew what they had to do in terms of organization. They knew how they had to create a quartermaster corps, the folks who send out the food and the ammunition to the different places. And they proceeded to do it. They proceeded to put muscle, subtly but effectively, muscle on the states to come up with money and to chip in the militia. They began the process very, very rapidly of organizing. And the base that they had for organization was the overwhelming support of the people for the revolution. I want to go off on a tangent for a moment. No census occurred where people said, oh, okay, I'm for the revolution, I'm for King George, I didn't make up my mind, I don't know. There's no sense. We don't know how many folks were one way or the other way. Most historians will say about a third of the folks were pro-revolution, maybe 20–25% were pro-loyalist, the rest were in the middle. My opinion is they're wrong. And I'll tell you the pieces of evidence that I looked at, that the support for the revolution was really pretty much overwhelming. After Lexington and Concord, after Bunker Hill, you had approximately something like 10 to 15,000 Americans surrounding Boston. That's a lot of folks in those days. A lot of folks who just picked up their rifle and went off individually and with their militia unit. That's a lot of folks. The British government thought, there were just a bunch of cranks like Sam Adams and radicals. You know, once we get in there and we kick that butt with one big battle, the whole thing will collapse. That's what the British government thought. If you read papers of the British officers who were writing correspondence to each other and home, get a whole different story. The British officers said, "Oh my God, these people hate us. I can't believe how they're not giving up. I think we're in trouble. I don't know if we can do this." So it wasn't simply there are a bunch of smart guys in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress. By this point in time, by 1775 and 1776, in my view, the overwhelming majority of the American population was for the revolution against Britain. And then there was the third element, which I'll speak about more next week, and that was the fact that we were getting aid from the very beginning from the French in particular, and somewhat from the Dutch. We've talked about this before. So it wasn't simply that we were isolated. In fact, it was the British who were isolated. And we'll discuss this next talk when I get into diplomacy. So in conclusion, on-the-job training worked. It didn't work overnight. The number of battles that we lost probably equaled in number the number that we won. The thing that really stands out in my mind, it's really a remarkable fact. And the British won, as I say, a lot of battles. No American army surrendered. 2 British armies surrendered at Saratoga and at Yorktown. Think about that for a second. Thank you. Next week, we'll do George and diplomacy. Any questions? We have, yes, Mary Sue.
Okay, now I'm on the Congress thing, because you talk about the Congress, just the Continental Congress, these are just the, is it the first year, tell me, because you talk about Congress. I know you talk about the Continental Congress. And this is 1775.
This is, by 1776, we're in the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress is the one really who's organizing the war and is the one predominantly at that period of time is carrying it through. There was no other Congress during the war. I'm probably not going to get into it, but eventually during the war they passed the first set of Articles of Confederation. It just gets off the tangent a bit. Yes, Ann.
When you talked about civilian control of the military.
I'm sorry, dear.
I'm getting back to the civilian control of the military, how
Right.
important that was and is. What was the situation in England? I mean, they modeled much of the army or the military on English.
It was the
form.
same. The civilian government control.
So it wasn't sort of out of the blue, this was not, okay.
That's correct. That's correct. The difference here, and we'll see this when we talk about, some of this is going out of chronological sequence, simply because it's easier for me to organize. But when we talk about Washington next week, I'm going to talk about the events at Newburgh and how close we came to a very different result. Yes, go ahead.
You talked about lines, going against lines,
Yes.
but are you going to talk at some point about how the Continental Army developed its strategy to fight? Because that broke down, if I'm not mistaken.
You're correct, and particularly in the South. The Americans, and I'll address this now because I may forget, and I don't want to forget. The Americans developed what the British thought were Indian tactics. Okay. Hiding behind the tree, hiding behind the rock, taking a punch. The Americans also developed a tactic specifically aiming to kill the British officers. Chop the head off, and the rest of the body is not going to function. But that was really later in the war. So let me illustrate this by talking about Lexington and Concord. Okay, so Lexington is the first place the British go to. A couple of shots go back and forth. I think 13 Americans, 8 Americans died. There were like 28 guys or something like that. Standing in lines, right? So then the British march on to Concord because that's where they thought the powder and the guns were, and that's what they wanted to seize. So what happens now is not an organized strategy. It happens that hundreds, thousands of farmers on the local militia and not on the local militia grabbed their gun and ran as fast as they could to where the fight was. And because they weren't organized, they didn't get in lines. So, okay, oh, there's a baddie, I'll get down here and I'm going to get behind the tree, or I'm going to get behind the rock. There was not an organizational structure and strategy to develop these kinds of tactics until much later in the war. Much later in the war, it became part of the American tactics. I forget it, I think it was the Battle of Camden or the Battle of Cowpen, 1779-ish, something like that, where the Americans developed this cool tactic, okay? The militia were the first to run from a fight because they had the least training, and the Continental troops were, as I've tried to say, had the strongest training. They were the elite of the army. So Cornwallis, in this battle, sees the American militia and starts moving his line up to the American militia. And the American strategy was very simple. Take one shot and run to the back. So then the British see the militia running away. Oh, there's another line of militia. Right, yeah. Their idea was take one shot and run for the back. So now the British line starts to break down because they got their bayonets and they're charging these bunch of idiot militia. And they come over the little hill and there's the Continental Army ready for them and blows them away. So yes, they did develop those tactics, but at the beginning of the war, it really wasn't there. And of course, that's part of the American mythology of, but it's true. That mythology comes from someplace. It comes from events that occurred. Yes, Dave?
I don't want to take your thunder away next week, but Washington screwed up over in western Pennsylvania.
Washington screwed up a lot.
Okay. And he almost lost his commission, I believe, and
Well,
somehow
okay.
he resurrected himself after that defeat with the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
They killed some French soldiers, and it was an accident. And
Well, what maybe it was an accident, maybe it wasn't. You're stealing my thunder from next
that's
week.
fine.
So I'll give, no. Okay.
Talk to the next.
So, Washington is at the Continental Congress sitting in a uniform. Why was he in a uniform? Well, he had been a militia officer on the staff of General Braddock. Okay? And General Braddock is going out and sends Washington out with a scouting party 1758 comes to my head. My head is so
You're close.
wild now, I don't know. Sends him out with a scouting party to see what the French are doing. And Washington gets into this little skirmish. An argument turns into a skirmish, turns into shooting, and some French guys get killed, and a couple of British guys get killed, and Washington hightails it back to Braddock, and they're in deep doo-doo. That was the beginning, literally, the start of the 7 Years' War. So, he did have experience. We'll talk more next week. You're not allowed to come next week.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Thanks.